Meditations with Ryan Slomak.
Hello and welcome to episode 43 of Meditations. I'm your host, Ryan Zlomek, and this is a show dedicated to making space for conversation with interesting people just to see what we can learn from one another. On today's show, we're going to yes and it with the one and only Laura Hall. If that name doesn't mean anything to you, you probably have been impacted by her music, and maybe you've even laughed at it or with it. Laura is the piano player, the music director from the TV show Whose Line Is It Anyway, for which she was on the show for 21 seasons. But she's pretty much the master of musical improv. She is the person who has pretty much put her mark on that very specific niche. And, other than playing on TV screens across the globe for over 20 years, she travels to different community centers and community groups to work with improv groups to teach them about improv. She's written the book about improv music, and she is just somebody who is out there demonstrating that you can find your place in the world no matter how specific a skill you develop. So without further ado, let's hear from the one, the only, the hilarious, the cheerful, the glorious Laura Hall. Laura, thanks so much for being here. I am a huge fan of Whose Line, but digging into your history, I'm like, just I'm enamored with the amount of creative stuff that you've done. But I have one really sort of cheeky question to start things off, which is, I as I was researching you and your husband Rick, he describes himself as a farmer as like one of his characteristics. And I was looking at your videos for the sweet potatoes, and you've got some farm stuff going on there. What's the farm connection to Laura and Rick Hall?
Ah, so Rick grew up on a farm. I grew up in the Chicago area. He grew up on a farm downstate Illinois. And so when we first got together, it was a big learning curve for me because I'd never really been around on a farm much before that. But yeah, so it's definitely a huge part of who Rick is. And the kind of characters that he tends to do, not all exclusively, but he definitely can like he did a gig for the like rural electric company in central Illinois, and he he's spot on for that, right? He can slide right in there. But then like with the sweet potatoes with my our band, I've always liked that sort of folk country, Emmylou Harris, that kind of stuff. I've always been a big fan of that. And so that kind of just all happened naturally as well because it was a kind of music that I really loved.
Awesome. Well, I'm glad that we already have a reference to things that you've always enjoyed, because I want to take a step back. I was reading that you kind of decided as a teenager that becoming a musician full time and having that be your career was what you were aspiring to. And I'm curious about like sort of young Laura Hall, and what how did music get its hooks in you when you were a kid?
When I was really young, there were a few. Like my grandfather played and sang, and he was self-taught, and I was enamored by that. No one in my immediate family was musical, but my grandfather was very musical. He played piano, he played several instruments, he sang. And then also when I was really little, or not like maybe 7, my parents took us to see Count Basie's band at the county fairground. And I was like, oh, what is that? And of course, Basie was the piano player, totally featured. And I was like, oh, maybe, you know. And then certainly as I got older, I had more female role models that I like. Joni Mitchell and Carole King were both big, like, oh, here's how women do this. So I definitely had some role models as I went who inspired me. And and I mean, not that I knew them personally. I didn't know Joni Mitchell, or although I met Joni Mitchell once and lost the power of speech because I was so overwhelmed by the experience. But that's another story. But yeah, so there were definitely along the way, there were people who encouraged me. Shockingly, my father encouraged me to be a musician. And he was the straightest arrow ever. He worked for IBM his entire life, his entire career. He was so like stable, steady. And he's like, yeah, choose a really unstable, hard to make, hard to make a living. Go for it. And I was like, wow, Dad, okay. So and my mom was a huge fan. Like, anyway, so I had a lot of support. I was really lucky.
What was, and just, like you're so multi-instrumental, it just blows my mind. Like I think I just saw a video of you playing an accordion and I was like, she does that too. But like, what was the first instrument that you started to learn?
It was piano. Yeah, that was the first. I begged and begged my parents, and so we got one when I was about 9. And then I was also in the orchestra at school, and I played French horn in school, and I liked that a lot. I've always liked that being part of a group, and like what you contribute is part of this bigger whole. And so like playing in an orchestra, I found just super thrilling being one part of a bigger whole. And that's why I love playing in bands and doing improv and stuff. Like you're one piece of it, but together you're better than any one piece of you. Does that make sense?
Oh, absolutely. And I'm curious about like, because you ended, if I understand, like I think you ended up going to college for music.
Mhm.
And what was, like before discovering improv, which we'll talk about shortly, because I just love that story. But like, how did you think you wanted to contribute to music, or what did you think you wanted to do with music before you kind of discovered that improv bug?
Yeah, I knew I wanted to play in bands and be a songwriter. I definitely was excited about writing. And then also, I had dreams of being a composer in a bigger way, like a film composer. That was something that always was in the back of my mind, or composing for theater, writing for theater. Um, and because I play, like I would play for musicals and stuff, I just had the like, wouldn't it be exciting to write these? So that was sort of the direction I thought I was going. And I have done some of those things as well, but improv ended up totally taking me by surprise and then totally being a much bigger part of my career than I had envisioned in the beginning.
Yeah, like so you ended up getting a job. I read in one source it said you started off doing coat check at Second City and another that you were a waitress. But like how did you end up getting connected with Second City?
Well, I was going to school at Loyola, right, and on the north side of Chicago. So if you grew up in Chicago, everybody knew about Second City. And then my sister had a job next door at the steak joint, and there were package deals between the theater and the right. So she had to talk to the guy in the box office all the time to coordinate people. He had a big crush on her. So he got me the job, hoping it would help him him have some success with her. And it did. I mean, they did end up getting married. I don't know if whether it was my coach job that did it, but yeah. So I was still in college, and the coach gig was perfect because everyone brings their coats in, then you just sit there for an hour and a half while the show's going on. So I would do my homework, and then they all get their coats and leave. So it was sort of like a perfect gig. But then waitressing was much better money, so I could work fewer times a week. I couldn't do my homework, but I made better money. And then sort of just by accident, they asked me if I wanted to go out with the touring company. And then I made less money again because the wages made more than the actors and musicians. But it was, you know, I would play in those days. Everyone could drink for free after the theater closed. Really bad business model. But we would all hang out, right? We were young, we would all hang out. And then a lot of times we'd open up the piano and I would just play, some Elton John or something and people sing along. So they knew I played. So they were like, yeah, you could do a show. You can go out with the touring company. Like, okay, sure. I've heard a lot of the shows, from waitressing. I had seen and heard a lot of the shows, but I got basically zero training. They just went, you can do this, go on.
And I just want to paint a picture and then ask a question real quick, just because I think like Second City is kind of like the diamond in the rough for the performance business. Like it's such an important staple. I mean, Saturday Night Live wouldn't exist without it. Clearly, the music department of Whose Line Is It Anyway wouldn't be nearly as awesome without Second City, right? Like it's this like what was I reading? It started off as like a cabaret joint and then turned into sort of an improv theater and now is, you know, kind of franchised and is like one of the biggest theaters or one of the biggest like improv and comedy theaters in the world. But like, what was the culture like there? Like you described that everybody drinks for free after the show's kind of over, but like what kind of clientele is coming in there? And like, what types of shows are you just like picking up through osmosis as you're like coat checking and waitressing?
So yeah, back when I was there, it was a much smaller sort of family run dysfunctional theater. Now it's a bigger corporate dysfunctional theater, but that's a whole nother story. Um, but it would be mostly tourists that we would get. And in the beginning when I started there was only the main stage, and then they had the touring company. Then they added the smaller theater called the ETC. Like all that happened during just those few years when I was, you know, co-checking waitressing. And then sometimes the touring company was getting booked so much they would have this sort of temporary touring company, a second string touring company. And that's what I started with. So I would do maybe one gig a month. We'd go up to Wisconsin for a weekend or something, right? So that was sort of the extent of it. But it was good because, like I said, I was still in college. So, you know, even maybe I missed a Friday class, but it would be fine, you know. But so the clientele was mostly tourists. The shows were mostly sketch. So there would be a sketch show for the first part of it, and then afterwards there'd be an improv set. And they would use the improv set to sort of help develop the material for the sketch show. Right. So they would get suggestions from the audience, but if something hit that was like, oh, that's interesting, or, you know, that we improvised it and went well, then they would refine it and turn it into a sketch. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Like it's you get the sort of polished material at the front half, and then after people have some drinks in them, you're like, all right, we're gonna
Right.
see what sticks.
Right. And the improv set was always free, because the founder of the theater, Bernie Solins, felt like it wasn't right to charge people for improv because you didn't know if it was going to be good or not. And so the improv set was always free. So we'd always get a bunch of college students and stuff, you know, who would come to the set if they could get in. Um, yeah, and at the main stage musician was named Fred Kaz. He was the one who was at Second City from the time it was a cabaret in the 60s. Fred basically created how music and improv work together, like single-handedly, because it was the theater that was coming up in America that was doing it, you know. And so I got to, as I was waitressing, I got to hear Fred a lot. So I did get a lot of how does the music work in the context of the show. I did learn a lot just from listening. And so I was a terrible waitress because I'd be like, you know, serving drinks and then I'd be, oh, that was so cool. How Fred, oh, wait, sorry, here's your beer, you know. And especially in the improv set was where I really learned it. You know what I mean? Like how he approached improvising to based on suggestions, that kind of stuff. So I did get the training in that way that I got to listen to the best. And Fred really was just brilliant. Every once in a while, he would give me a tiny little pearl of wisdom, like in passing, and it'd be like, there's your training. You know what I mean? Like, but it was things were much looser then. Now there's a whole system with the conservatory. Like my husband Rick, he auditioned once and got in. He was new to Chicago. He'd never done any of the classes there. You know what I mean? Now there's a conservatory, everyone goes through the conservatory. It's a much more thought out. When we were there, it was sort of the Wild West.
Well, and I think that's why it yielded such good results because when you're trying out crazy things, the things that really stand out is typically stuff that no one has ever seen or heard before.
Mhm. Yes, I feel like it was more open-ended. It was looser. Um, yeah, I mean, not that every single thing we did was brilliant, but it did feel looser than it does now.
Awesome. Well, just to stay at Second City for a little bit longer, I mean, I love just the fact that like after hours you're just like comfortably playing piano and people are recognizing your talent and are like, "Oh, we can use her." Like how did you end up getting integrated into that? I mean, were you doing improv performances at this regular Second City or you just went straight to touring?
I went straight to touring. Yeah. I'd never done improv before. Although, a lot of things I realized after I got started with it, a lot of things that musicians do, like if you're playing for a dance class, where you're starting, stopping, starting, stopping. Oh, change the tempo. Oh, can you play something in three now? You know what I mean? I don't know if anyone's ever played for dance classes before, but they can be really kind of brutal in that way. But it's also really good training. I did piano bar. I did if you're accompanying a singer like at church or a soloist in a context, they lose their place. You have to figure out where they are. All those performance experiences of having to be flexible and adjusting to what's happening, all that really did help me in terms of being able to do improv. But I had no like aspirations to be an improv musician. Really, although I'd been to Second City and I'd heard Fred play when I was a kid and went to Second City. And I thought he was super cool, but I had zero aspiration like, oh, I'm going to do this for a living. I didn't even think of it as being a thing that you could do.
I feel like there's like that glorious moment of like constant signs that something is going to stick. And you're like, nah, I mean, because you eventually went to UCLA to study film composition, right? So, like, it's
Right.
just like, oh, they're telling me I'm good at music improv. Oh, I'm part of a touring company. Well, I still got to finish classes. I mean, there's just something beautiful and hysterical about that, Laura.
And when people talk about like, oh, you have to have your 5-year plan and you have to do this, for me, I never had a 5-year plan. I feel like in a lot of ways, I kind of have stumbled from thing to thing. But the other way you could look at it is having an open heart to different kinds of opportunities, right? You can't, I couldn't have known at 18 that I would book Who's Line. You know what I mean? Like, there's no way. Or could I have even put that in my 5 or 10 year plan? But I followed my heart with the opportunities that came, and my that's how my career has been. Now, I'm not saying people shouldn't perhaps be a little more a little more organized than me, but for me, that's how it's worked.
I love it. And just one last question about this sort of time doing the touring is like, do you remember like your first performance with Second City? Like, where was it? What type of roles were you playing, or like what type of auditions were you giving with your music?
So I don't remember exactly, but it was a university. It was, a lot of the touring company stuff was colleges and universities. So it was a university. It was not a super huge hall, but I was so nervous about like stepping on the actor's toes or getting in the way was sort of my is what my nervous energy did. And so I was playing like a mouse. I was so quiet and so timid, and afterwards, they were like, did you play at all? And I'm like, oh, I guess I don't have to be quite that timid. And then Fred did hear me play. So on Monday nights, the touring company would play on the main stage, right? That was just the tradition always. So the theater was never dark, you know. So Fred heard me play one Monday and he said, you know, you when there's six actors on stage, there are seven improvisers. You're one of them. You need to take your place. You're not like an addition or a little thing. No, you step up just like the six actors do. And so you're making offers just like they're making offers. You're reacting to their offers just like they're reacting to each other's. And that for me was the big light bulb. Like, oh, I'm not just on the sidelines doing something. I am a part of this. And if I don't step up and play my part, I'm doing them a disservice. So that was my big light bulb moment.
Oh, that's amazing. Well,
Yeah.
the light bulb shined for a little while, and then, as I mentioned, you decided to move to Los Angeles, like, and pursue a degree in film composition, if I understand. What was that transition like? Because you're Chicago born and bred, and then you're like, all right, I'm gonna head over to the City of Angels.
Well, and actually, really, the reason we moved to LA was because my husband Rick, who is an actor, got a series. And so he was like, let's try it for a year and see what happens. And I have to say, I was kind of reluctant, and I had a lot going on in Chicago. By that point, I was doing stuff. I had left Second City, but I was doing stuff with the Annoyance. I was in like five different bands. I had a world, a creative world. But it also was interesting, the thought of going and trying something new. But it really was inspired by his getting that series. And then I kind of had to figure out what to do with myself. So I played every open mic. I sat in with anyone who wanted, a musician, improv wise, singer songwriter wise. I really, when we moved to LA, I was like, I'm going to quit doing improv because it's sort of a dead end. It's such a being a musician for improv is the niche within the niche, right? And I'm like, I'm going to quit doing this. I'm going to pursue, the film and composition and stuff. And I never did get the degree at UCLA. I just took some really good classes. But and actually, I think learning film scoring made me a better improviser, right? Because you're underscoring scenes all the time. So there's definitely a relationship. Anyway, um, so it was so good for me because I just started playing with different people. There were a certain number of Second City people who had all moved to LA around the same time. Jeff Machowski and Jane Morris opened an improv theater in Santa Monica. Some of the people I'd toured with were in the area. So that was really helpful. And but I really was like, I'm not really gonna pursue improv. And then I got the opportunity to audition for Who's Line. And I was like, oh, I'll do improv again.
Yeah, and from what I understand, it was because of another Second City connection.
Exactly. So my friend Ron West, who I had toured with at Second City, he had done the British version. And then they hired him as a producer when they were coming to America. And he recommended me, and he recommended Fred. Right. So me and Fred were supposed to audition, and I auditioned first, and they just gave it to me.
Can you tell us about that audition? I mean, I heard that what was it? You, Brad Sherwood, and Wayne Brady were like the group that all auditioned together, and all three
Yeah.
of you got it.
Yes, the three of us auditioned together. And it was so weird because it was like in the producer's hotel room. And I'm like, what is happening here? I didn't know Wayne. I had done a couple gigs with Brad in, a different context, because as much as I was like, I'm not pursuing improv, that was where I knew people. So of course, I would pick up a gig here and there. Anyway, yeah. So the three of us auditioned. We all got the gig. I really the initial buy was just for 6 episodes, and it was the British host. They were doing it like test marketing. So they brought the British host in, but then all the American actors and me, and then they used it to test market it. But they also aired it on the BBC. It was pretty smart. And they discovered that people really liked it, and they were like, oh, once we have Drew in, they're going to love it, because Drew was the top rated show on ABC at that point. Drew Carey was. He was really well known, really well loved. So it was sort of a match made in heaven.
Yeah, and like I've listened to interviews with Drew Carey talk about the show, and it's kind of like I mean, talk about yes and. I mean, he's doing that show, and then it's like I've got all these friends who are improvers, and there's these UK people who want to like see if we can enter a new form of entertainment, television entertainment in the market. And he's like, oh yeah, I'll use my stature, and like we'll be able to get this show off the ground.
Absolutely. And bless his heart, he took improv classes. He went and took improv one at Groundlings. You know what I mean? Like or wherever he went. But yeah, he was like, oh, if I'm going to do this, I should learn a little bit about it. And it's like when he first got his television show, he'd been doing stand-up, but stand-up is different than acting. And so he took acting classes. Like, I love his student mind, like, oh, yeah, like it was not oh, I'm too big a star to take an improv class. You know what I mean?
I want to know who taught him how to be a TV show host. That, like,
Yeah.
what class did he take for that?
Yeah, that part I think is really natural to him. And obviously the game show, like it's just really natural to him. He's really good at meeting people. It's like that's sort of who he is. He's really good and super gracious with meeting people. And that's sort of half of what being a host is. You know what I mean?
Yeah, well, we've seen the Drew Carey show. We'll get back to the Laura Hall show now. Like,
Okay.
I'm curious about, like, so there's a bunch of things I want to ask about Whose Line. So we'll start to kind of dissect it little bits at a time, if you don't mind. But so they do the 6 episode run, and like a lot of people, especially those of us who are living on the other coast, don't understand how these types of things are filmed. So, like, when you're doing a 6 episode run of Whose Line, like, what is a shooting schedule like that look like? Like, how many episodes were you guys shooting in a day? Like, how big of a contract was that?
Right. So it that changed as we went on, because obviously we ended up doing it for 21 seasons, shockingly, maybe 22.
I think 21 and 431 episodes is what I
Yeah,
was finding.
yeah.
Yeah.
So in the beginning, we were getting 1 or 2 episodes per tape day, right? So an episode is usually about 6 or 7 games. So we would tape maybe 14 games, and then we might get 2 episodes out of it. Then they were like, let's try taping. So in the first one, that's what we did. I think we had 5 tape days for 6 shows, just to make sure that they had plenty of coverage, and also that they could use the best of the best, right? So although we're improvising, it's also edited, right? So if something doesn't go that well, it just doesn't make it to air, which is like a lot of people don't realize that. To me, it's not cheating. We're still improvising. It's just they're taking what's best because it's television and people have a shorter attention span on television than in real life. Okay, anyway, so then as we got going, they were like, okay, what if we do 16? We can pretty consistently get 2 shows out of that, right? Oh, now let's try doing 18 or 20 or 22. We kept doing more games. It kept becoming more and more. And towards the end, we would always get 3 and sometimes get 4 out of one tape day. When you think about how cost effective that, just from the sheer numbers, how cost effective that is compared to a sitcom where they work all week and they get 1 episode. We work one day and get 3, maybe 4. We never have to change our sets, right? And in the single day, people always go, oh, so did you change clothes? No, we wear the exact same clothes. Nothing changes, and nobody notices or cares. And what they can do then is pick and choose from, like, because they like to have, like, say, 2 music games per show. So we can record it in any order. It doesn't matter. And then they can pick and choose. Oh, this was a really good hoedown. This was a really good greatest hits. And then this was a really good, and so they're piecing it together. And nobody cares that there are 3 episodes where we're wearing the exact same clothes.
That's so funny. Did they change the audience during this? No, same
Nope.
audience for the whole day.
Nope, same audience. It was, especially the longer we got, it was a marathon for the audience. And they wouldn't give them much of a break to, like, have a chance to go pee or anything, like, I was like, man. So a lot of them, they'd be standing outside in line, and then once they come in, it would be 4 hours of taping, maybe, yeah, usually about 4.5 hours of taping. That's a long, long time. And with one break. It's a long, long time to ask the audience to be there. And whenever I had guests, I'd always be like, bring snacks, bring water. They're not going to let you, they're not going to let you go. They're not going to feed you. Yeah. But the audiences, they held up remarkably well. Like I was always shocked how game the audiences were and how willing they were to sit there for 4 hours, you know.
And how many days a week were you typically filming?
Well, we almost always would, for some reason, like January, the beginning of the year was the time when we would tape the most. And so, like, if we had an order for, like, say this last time we taped, we had an order for, I think it was 16, and we had 5 tape days, but they were over like 4 weeks, right? So we'd tape, say, on a Sunday and then again on a Thursday or whatever. We never were doing it back to back. And part of that was because everybody else had so much other stuff going on, you know. So it would be a little bit scattered like that. But yeah, I mean, it is kind of remarkable that we could do a whole season in 5 or 6 days.
Yeah, it's like you're like, all right, we need to do the season for 2024. And then by February 1st, you're like, what am I going to do for the next 11 months?
Right. Which actually, in some ways, is the beauty of it, that you can do so much other stuff. And when my kids were little, I just went back. I was a stay-at-home mom in between. And it was fantastic. I had 10 months home with my kids. But then the shift from being like mom of two toddlers to now, like, yes, now you're on a TV show. That was always a really hard transition for me.
I can't even imagine. I want to talking about Whose Line a little bit more. Like I'm curious about so you talked about, doing 14, 18 games a show, filming for 4 hours, that kind of being broken up. Like let's talk about your own skill sets and your own chops that sort of developed as the show went on, because I got to say, like, it's fun watching the show and seeing how each person kind of develops. And for you, we'll talk about it a little bit later, but like you became, to me at least, like the master of music genres, like to the extent where like it seemed like everybody is just going out of their way to almost to create genres that, like, we're not sure if Laura can do this, and it's like, oh my god, she did like poppy gangster rap or whatever, like,
I,
but what types of, especially looking at your growth from the kind of start of the show to let's say the end of the Drew Carey years, like 2007, like how did you see yourself grow as a musician throughout that time?
oh, I grew a ton. And I also have to just say, once Linda Taylor, the guitar player, started, that completely opened things up, right? Because we could do so many more genres. We could do guitar driven genres with some authenticity that I couldn't do on just piano, right? Like or even keyboard, like even an electronic keyboard. Like it's really hard to do heavy metal, even on a keyboard. You really need the shredding guitar, you know? So part of it was Linda and I grew in terms of learning, of working together, because it's such a close, like if it's Linda, me, and Wayne, it's like this little triangle of communication that's happening on the fly that has to be really strong. And so Linda and I grew as a partnership, and her and I have gone on and like scored films together and done all this other stuff together because we work together so well. But the biggest thing was like before that, I felt like I was pretty good at playing genres. But most of the time, the kind of genres you get in a live show are the big, broad ones: gospel, blues, funk. You know what I mean? You're getting a musical theater, you're getting these sort of big, broad genres. And so you have tons of options within them, for one thing. And I felt like I was pretty good at that. But then as the show went on, and it wouldn't just be reggae, now it's Bob Marley, right? So it's like, okay, so Wayne is doing some sort of Bob Marley impersonation, and so it's like figuring out what makes Bob Marley specifically sound like Bob Marley. And it's such a great exercise in sort of deconstruction and listening to these different genres. And I do have to tell you, with full disclosure, they would give us a list ahead of time of potential genres that were going to show up in that weekend, right? So if we were going to tape on a Saturday, by Tuesday, Linda and I would get a list of 100 possible genres. And some of them were easy, blues, piece of cake, right? But then some of them were, yeah, like, Russian folk metal. Well, I don't know what Russian folk metal sounds like. It's not a genre I've listened to. So then we would have to do all this research, right? And what I discovered about Russian folk metal is it's basically metal, but I played these weird little fluty folk melodies over Linda shredding, right? Right. So you kind of figure out, like, what is this? What makes this genre tick? You kind of deconstruct it, you figure out, and then you figure out how can we do it and how can we make it recreate it in a way that's accessible for our singers in this context, right? So there's some authenticity, but also we're constantly adapting it to the instrumentation we have at hand. But also, improv is a specific form. And because they're making it up as they go, sometimes things have to be adjusted so that they can find their way in. Does that make sense?
Yeah, you got to make sure that as you're constructing the song, that you're constructing a song where there is a recognizable pattern. There's a place for somebody to input their own, vocal patterns or their own rhyme schemes that you can then hopefully hear and make sure that you're staying in tune with them. Is that kind of how you're explaining it?
Exactly. And some genres, like, they like 70s, like at one point they wanted to do like something like Rush or one of those kind of 70s bands. Those are like these long, huge forms with very little repetition. And it's like, we can't do that. That we need to have some repetition. Like, yeah, we have to build some patterns within it and then follow each other's, But I felt like Linda and I got really good at it, and we got a really good shorthand between us and really good communication while we were playing in terms uh, of watching and knowing. Because the thing is too, like, even if, like, you never know, is Wayne going to go to a chorus? Does he want to sing another verse? Does the song have a bridge? Not very many of them do, like in Greatest Hits, because those songs are short. But in other songs, other song games, there might be a bridge. There might be two choruses at the end. We don't know any of that. So we're having to watch each other and watch Wayne. And, it's a really interesting exercise in like intuitive connection.
All right, so I want to get really microscopic and then really
Okay.
macroscopic if we can.
Okay.
So let's say there's a greatest hits happening. I think the one that I just watched was Ryan and Colin doing a series of songs about accounting, and then it comes to you and Linda, and you need to, like, all of a sudden figure out, this is okay, this is the genre. Like, are there quick interpersonal communications that are happening? And then while you're looking to her and you're looking to Wayne, what type of nuances or signs are you looking for to figure out how to stay like the loop and in the vibe?
Yeah, that is the sort of the tricky part. So the first thing that has to happen is, and again, like I said, we had lead time to prep. Linda and I did, to prep some of these genres. Especially, like I said, in the more obscure ones, like we had to do research to figure them out. And so we would have listened, we would have picked, like, say, a drum groove. We would have picked instrumentation. Okay, you're going to play bass, I'm going to play piano and strings, and then you're going to have the drum groove, right? Well, we would sort of preset that stuff, because otherwise we'd be spending, like, hold on, everyone. Okay, do you have drums? Blah, blah, blah. You know what I mean? So we'd be, I've got bass in my left hand, piano in my right. You're playing electric guitar. It's my drums, right? So we've got that thought of in advance. So as soon as we hear the suggestion, we're pulling up those things we need, the sounds and the drums, okay? And then almost always one or the other of us would lead. Linda or I would lead. So if it's a guitar driven style, she would take the charge. I can read guitar chords in a guitar player's hands, which is a really handy skill for this particular for this thing. So I could read and follow her in that way. If it's a more piano driven, if it's musical theater, right? So it's really piano driven, then I'm leading the charge and she's following me. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And I just want to, one comment I forgot to make earlier is I just want to point out something totally absurd, which is you said, oh, well, just, just to let everybody know, we got the music genres ahead of time. And then you said we were given a list of about 100. So like it's such an absurd amount of information to even sit there. But it sounds like if we're breaking this down to like little blocks, it seems like, all right, here's a genre. Here's the leader of that genre between you and Linda. Here are the tools that we need. This is the drum machine that I'm using. These are the different sounds I need to be able to have come out of my keyboard. This is the instrument that Linda's playing. And then let's see if this works.
Exactly. Exactly. And a lot of times we would even, it was very helpful for us to, like, if we get, if we got Michael Jackson as a suggestion, well, even within one artist, there's a wide variety of music, right? And an artist like Elton John. So, he's got a wide variety too. So it's interesting because what you're looking for is something that would be immediately recognizable, right? So you're not thinking about obscure Michael Jackson tracks. You're thinking about, oh, what's one that people really know, Billie Jean, or do you know what I mean? And then we would pick one to kind of be our rhythmic and sound framework. So we're not playing Billie Jean, but we're using that kind of as like a template, or sometimes it might be, Billie Jean plus another song kind of mashed up, or you know what I mean? So we're kind of using using the original songs as a template. But it is interesting because you want to get so that in the first 8 bars, people go, oh yeah, that's Wayne Newton, or that's, whoever, whatever the thing is. Yeah. So you have to really you do have to be quick with it.
I
Um,
appreciate I appreciate you saying the 8 bars thing because I vividly remember watching one episode where it was stadium rock was the genre, and within the first few notes I'm like, oh, it's Journey. Like it instantly hits you, and you're like, okay, this is the thing I'm familiar with. Let's see how they play in this playground.
exactly. And we're even though we're not doing specifically a journey, he's not just singing, we're not just playing a Journey song, and he's not just singing a Journey song and sticking new words in it. But yeah, so that's the trick. And yet, how does it give you that trigger of, oh yeah, that's Journey, oh that's Stadium Rock, oh that's, now we're going to unpack it. So it's partly how we're playing, but of course a huge part is how they're singing. That then Wayne, who is super well versed in genres, he's such a good musician, he knows how to vocally do the thing that makes you go, oh yeah, that sounds like Journey, right? And that's a really fascinating, him being able to do that vocally. I certainly couldn't do that, you know, but that's a skill set.
But you can quickly learn 100 different genres in a weekend, so I think that makes up for it. Looking at things macroscopically, I'm curious about, like you're not just the piano player. Like I want to make sure that we clear that up for listeners at home. Like, you did one awesome video on YouTube where you showcased all of the instruments and all the things that were happening. And like, here's the keyboard, here's the other synthesizer I have, here's the other keyboard, here's a drum machine. Guess what? Here's another drum machine. Here's all the pedals. Here's the pedals that I can use to create actual drum beats at the time. Here's all the things that Linda's using. Here's the instruments I wish I got to use. Like, there are so many things that are happening within that. That's just, my brain can't handle it. But the other thing I'm just curious about is you're also the music director of the show. And I'm curious about like what that role meant or means. Like when we say, okay, you're the musical director of Whose Line Is It Anyway? Like, what types of responsibilities did you have? And then how did that play out into the show?
Um, yeah, musical director in improv is so different than like musical director for like musical theater or something, right? Because it's not like I'm teaching them. I'm not teaching the singers how to sing what they're going to sing, right? I think it mostly it is the like sort of interacting with the producers about what they want and how they envision it, and a lot of times they would want to preview a genre if we were gonna, especially if it was something like really obscure, like, oh, it's crunk. Well, I don't, crunk, I don't know what that is. They weren't sure what crunk was either. They just found that word, right? So then they're like, can you audition for us something that would be like crunk to see if it's actually usable? So part of it was sort of interacting with them. And in the beginning, Linda had never done any improv before, but she'd played in so many different contexts, and she's a super versatile musician. So in the beginning, it was when she started, it was sort of coaching her to some extent and helping her understand the parameters of what happens with improv. And besides that, Wayne knew what he was doing. It wasn't like I was coaching him. Every once in a while, one of the other singers, I might give them notes, like Jeff Davis or Chip Aston or Brad Sherwood. But really, for those guys knew what they were doing. So there wasn't the need for me to give them notes. And it also, yeah, like, when you're doing musical theater, the musical director is totally teaching all the music to the singers. This is just such a completely different thing.
That's really interesting. So, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
Oh no, I was going to say, I don't know if that's if that's a useful answer, but that's sort of the reality of it.
I mean, it seems like you're almost like a musical medic. Like your job is to be on the side and make sure that you know when to step in and aid people when they need it. Because in improv, it's like if you knew all the games that were coming or whatever, there'd be a magic that's sort of gone, as opposed to you're there and you're anticipating a million different scenarios that could happen, but also just referencing like, hey, maybe this person could use some guidance or an idea of a signal to look for when they're doing their next song.
Right. And I will say also live improv is different than Whose Line in a lot of ways in terms of how the MD functions. Partly because we on Whose Line we never got to underscore, right? We never underscored a scene. And that was partly the editing, partly whatever. But when you're doing live improv, you're also doing underscoring, you're also connecting scenes and games, depending on whether you're doing long form or short form. So there can be more roles that the musical director takes in terms of shaping the whole show. So it is a little different, and then it's different depending on whether you're doing long form or short form. And then also how experienced your singers are. Sometimes the musical director is in a live context is really coaching and helping their singers learn how to do this better. So it can vary depending on the context of what you're doing.
And if I can just clarify the term underscore, you're referring to the idea that like in a traditional live theater setting, a musician will be adding some sort of music or ambiance to sort of help a scene out, and that in Whose Line, that's not there. That is not something that happens. It's purely the audience reaction and the actors.
Right. And then a few games like Film Noir, they used a pre-recorded track for that. And I don't know why. I always wanted us to do it because it would be so fun, but they did. But right. So in live improv, the musician is making all sorts of choices about when and where to play under a scene, when not to play, which is just as important. And what kind of genres you bring to that, what kind of the underscore, whether it's television, film, theater, improv, the underscore can shape a scene in ways that the audience is completely unaware of. We're like the subliminal, you know what I mean? The subliminal addition to it. And, you can take a scene at a funeral and obviously you can play it really sad. And that will have one thing, but it might be that the scene somehow becomes sexy. And then that funeral music can turn into something, something kind of sexy, or it might, you know what I mean? Or people might be thrilled that the guy's dead and then it can be happy music, right? So like the music can really be part of that emotional underpinning of any scene. And the musician is shaping it way more than the audience ever realizes.
Yeah, absolutely. I could talk to you about whose line is it like is it anyway all day, but I'm going to try to limit myself because you've done so many other cool things. But the one other thing I'm kind of curious about is the camaraderie or lack thereof of the group there, because one of the things that I just always found really interesting is the way people respond to you when you're announced on Whose Line. I mean, it's like, and now to Laura Hall, and like there is just an enthusiasm and an engagement with the audience, with the actors. It at least from the audience perspective, it seems as though you're very highly regarded, you're very highly appreciated. And some of my favorite stuff are the quips from the actors after the thing is done about like, wow, I didn't expect that guitar riff, or like that drum machine was awesome. Like, can you talk a little bit about the dynamic between like the cast and you, and kind of how you feel as a part of that mechanism?
Well, I've always felt like I got along really well with the cast, and it, like I said earlier about that thing from Fred, like Linda and I were part of the cast. We never felt separated, or you know what I mean, or less than from the cast. At least sometimes people will say stuff like, oh, aren't you lucky you get to play with those talented people? And I'm like, aren't they lucky they get to play with me? I mean, but that's just like audience members. Or else they'll assume, people will sometimes assume that I would rather be doing the acting side of improv. And they'll be like, why don't they let you improvise? I'm like, well, A, I am improvising. And B, this is what I love to do and what I'm good at. Anyway, that's a side note. But I've always really gotten along with the guys. And now that I'm touring with Who's Live, and we did a lot of touring in the past, we get along really well. Partly on the road, we get along because everybody gives each other space, which is an important part of being able to spend a lot of time in a van together. Um, but I've always felt like part of that group, and I've always felt really respected by the guys, and that's a nice feeling because it doesn't always happen for musicians in this context, in the context of doing improv.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. It's that sort of behind the scenes component I've always assumed was very strong and awesome, but you never know, and it's just something I was kind of curious about. Since you did talk about Who's Live, I'll just point out that for Syracuse listeners, that tour is coming to us on May 14th, and I'm kind of curious about the way in which an episode of Whose Line would operate versus an episode of Who's Live will operate. I'm curious about for you, like how maybe your approach to things is a little bit different, or if it's just like a really nice sort of placement in a new town every day.
Well, it is one-nighters most of the time. Is that what you're asking? Like how?
Yeah, and just like how the show is similar or different based off
Oh,
of
okay. Yeah, right. So the games, almost all of them are games that we've played on Whose Line. Like we always do greatest hits. We bring someone up and sing to them. We do a lot of the games that we do on Whose Line. The main difference is, because it's live and not television, we get to stretch out. On television, there was always the time concern of when, commercial breaks and things have to be short and, you know, short and sweet so that you can fit, so we can get two games in before the next commercial break, right? They were always thinking about that. Also, people do have a shorter attention span on television than they do live improv. They're vested in it, man. They drove to come here, they bought the tickets, you know what I mean? They're already vested. So we get to stretch out more. The games tend to go longer. They tend to be looser and more just sort of free form because there's not that component of the outside producer, especially when we were on ABC. There was a lot of, because it was ABC Family, the language all had to be family friendly. The live show is not. So everything kind of stretches out more. But the other thing is I get to underscore. I get to play those connecting pieces between games, right? So one game is finishing, someone's helping the audience member who was a volunteer get back to their seat. There's that little bit of time before the intro to the next game, and I get to play there, and that kind of keeps the ball in the air in between things, right? And really, I think underscoring is actually my very favorite thing to do in improv. Isn't that funny? Because it's the least out front, you know? But yeah, so we all get to stretch out more. Like the songs and greatest hits are quite a bit longer because we don't have that the time frame. And it's really fun playing with the guys. So the group had been pretty stable for quite a while, but now it's mixing up more. And that's fun too. Like we had Chip with us for a while. We've got Gary Anthony Williams has done several. So it's fun to have different people. We all have this common language and this common sort of knowledge of the Whose Line games, but it's different people who bring a different energy and a different thing. And so it's actually super fun. The shows themselves are super fun. The touring gets a little tiring, the travel aspect of it. And I have to like make sure I take care of myself and stay healthy and all that stuff. But the shows themselves, they're the high point of the day.
I love it. Well, thank you for dissecting that for a fan. I truly appreciate it. In the realm of other things that you've done, though, I mean, like, Laura, like looking into your career and seeing like that you've done children's albums and that you've done children's albums with Richard Daltrey from The Who, and that I was listening to your instrumental album that you came out with just a fairly recently, like today, just as I was doing research on you. And I'm curious about like that part of your career, just in the sense that like, and when I say that part of your career, I mean you're kind of like your studio album accomplishments, just in the sense that there is something very different about the ephemeral nature of improv, where the moment flashes before you and it's gone, and in your case, it just happened to be televised, but like that's just the thing and it's gone. And then the very intensive, this is exactly what I want from my studio recording process. And I'm wondering if you could just like shed some light into the way in which you approach making a studio album.
It is really interesting. And sometimes I have to work hard to shift those gears because the problem I think for almost all musicians, we get in the studio and we can freeze ourselves up or narrow ourselves in because you're like, oh, this is permanent. It has to be perfect. And perfection can be the enemy of creativity, right? So you have to find that tipping point of um of yes, you want it to be polished and clean and lovely, and you don't want to regret it when you hear it a year later. But you still have to stay free and in the moment while you're recording. And that's the interesting challenge, I think, for almost all recording artists. A lot of times I do use improv to start my process as a writer. And the one that you listened to, the instrumental one that I made during the pandemic, um, that one was they're all sort of half improvised. Like I had sketched them, I'd improvised and then I sketched out the shape, and then when I recorded it, I was improvising. And that was really fun for me. Because again, I just felt like because I built it in that it was they were sort of half improvised, because I built it in, it helped keep me more free. Also, that was me all by myself. I was engineering it and recording it. And that's when you especially can get in your head and get like micro, you know. So I really needed a way to help keep myself loose. Because when you were recording with a band or something, you've got the energy of the other people, you know. And like I said in the beginning, I'm a collaborator. I love being part of a group. So it was unusual for me to do that instrumental album just completely on my own. It was the pandemic though.
You had to do something.
Yes, it was a good challenge too. Like I'm a big fan of challenging myself. Yeah, so if you look at my Spotify playlist, I've got like everything, from this instrumental music to children's music to the sweet potatoes. Like I've got such a variety. Either people can't figure out what to make of it, or it's interesting that I have such a variety, but I've always been interested in a really wide variety of kinds of music and stuff. So it makes sense when I look back, you know what I mean, at my interests when I was younger. Um, I'm like, oh, yeah, I loved jazz and I loved the Pretenders and I loved Joni Mitchell. So it's like, uh, to me, it makes sense, but I think maybe to an outsider, it might be kind of strange. But that's the artist I am.
Well, as a listener, we're all still disappointed that you haven't released your Russian folk metal album yet.
Exactly. But also I do think my interest in that wide variety is partly why I'm good at what I do. With working with different genres and stuff.
Yeah, like one theme, especially when I've read interviews from you or whatever, is you talk about like everybody has imposter syndrome. Like let's just acknowledge that. Like right now, I'm faking an interview with you. For 21 seasons, you've been figuring out how to be an improv, musician on Whose Line. Like everybody has imposter syndrome, but like in your interviews, I've just read consistently, you make the comment that like I'm within this niche thing and I'm not sure if that's the right place to be. And then a breath later, you're like, no, this is exactly what I need to be doing because I figured that out. And that is the whole journey. Like, that's the goal. And I think it's just, I really appreciate people who are able to take their skills and say, you know what, I'm going to try this thing. And then what you realize is eventually you look behind you and you've got a whole like paved road that you've created of accomplishments. And you're like, oh, that was what I was meant to do. And you just kind of, you learn it while you're doing it.
Yes, I've definitely had a big experience of that, learning it as I go. And also, like when I was talking about looking ahead at my 5-year plan and all that, I never could have guessed so many of the things that happened for me, and when I have, for example, had the opportunity to work with Roger Daltrey on a children's video, like who would have guessed that that would be? And yet I did, and it was great. And I said yes, and we did 3 of them, so it's like, it is that thing of having an open heart to it. And yeah, but I do that too. I look back and I go, wow, what a strange journey it's been.
Well, it's pretty cool. I have one other production question, and then I have one other big kahuna I want to tackle with you, if that's cool. So, in
Okay.
regards to sort of, I don't want to say smaller stuff. I just like I think it ties in with your studio work. But you went to school to UCLA to study film composition, and you have done it. I mean, and in a variety of genres. I mean, you've done soundtracks for documentaries about the Holocaust, and you've done romantic comedies, and you've done short films and other feature films. And I'm curious about how you approach under and overscoring film productions. I guess just tell us a little bit about your process, if you don't mind.
Well, what's interesting is I do end up using improv a lot. in my film scoring as well. It's so funny how skills cross and can inform each other. In the sense that a lot of times the first thing you do when you're working on a film is you meet with the producer, director, editor, those people, and then you're talking about, well, this is where we're thinking the music might go in and might go out, and we want to emphasize this emotional aspect of the scene, or we want this to feel really energized, or those kind of. So they're taking that emotional language, and then you're trying to figure out what you're translating that to music. Again, I feel like that's really sort of what happens when you're underscoring an improv. You're looking at the emotional language and heightening it. And then and a lot of times I will just run the film and improvise along with it and record it, and then try something, go back, mute that, improvise something completely different, try something completely different. And I'll do like 3 or 4 of those. And then I'll go back and listen to them and I can start to see the points where it's like, oh, if there's a build musically and it's leading to this line of dialogue, oh, that can be a lovely moment or whatever. So I'm using those improv skills for that first creative step and then refining it, right? I might orchestrate it, I might, whatever those things are. I guess this is a weird connection, but it's sort of like how I was talking about, we would improvise the set at Second City and then it would become the sketches, right? They would get refined and become the sketches. It's sort of like that for me. I've scored with Linda Taylor on a few things, and I loved working with her on stuff. She's much more of a techie than me, so that also, it's really nice to not have to be in charge of the tech so much, because that's the part I always get stuck on. But it really is all the same. It's telling a story, and how does the music enhance and heighten the story. It really is the same whether you're doing theater, improv, movies, television.
Yeah, and I think, in the world of film composition, like you just talked about Linda and her technology skills. The technology has changed the whole game of film composition, and I guess I just want to clarify that, like, when we say that you're composing a film, you're not sitting there like, is it Ennio Morricone or like John Williams with a sheet of paper and writing things down and then planning to communicate that to a 200-piece orchestra. It's you and the technology and Linda and whomever your other collaborators are building the whole thing. I mean, like, you are putting every piece together with real instruments and with digital instruments in order to get it out there. Is that a fair assessment?
Yes, absolutely. And the biggest, I mean, a lot of times I'm doing digital instruments, so I'm doing the overlaying. But the biggest, like, live orchestra in quotes that I worked with was like, I had like a 6-piece for the second Auschwitz movie, the documentary. And that was really fun because that was really different. And we were playing, I had it all written out and all timed out with a click, but then we were playing together in one room. So you had the live feeling as well as I was using my studio and the technology to, and that's how a lot, even when something is going to be a big orchestrated thing, they're doing it to a click that they've a click track with the tempos and stuff, so that they know exactly how long the piece is going to be and when it's going to go in and when it's going to go out and when this line of dialogue happens and that little thing happens. So it's so much of it is about the timing. That's the part that's different than improv, in the sense that you really can get in the minutia of the timing to match up with what's happening on the screen.
Yeah, just another connection is probably like while you were working with ABC, like having to constrain things within commercial breaks. Like, I'm sure that you honed that skill whether you realized it or not.
Right. Yeah, exactly. You do kind of get that sense of timing. But again, even though a lot of it is in my studio and digital, it's the collaborative thing. And that again, being able to communicate with directors, being able to listen and interpret, ask questions back, all that kind of back and forth. Again, I see there is a similarity to improv, even though you're not doing that actual thing of talking back and forth, but you're kind of having that back and forth dialogue in the moment on the fly when you're doing it with improv.
I think all this means is that hundreds and hundreds of people have had improv experiences with you and haven't known it. So the other, as I mentioned, there's one other big kahuna that I don't think you get enough credit for. And, very rarely can I say, I'm talking with the person who wrote the book on music improv, but I quite literally am talking to the person who wrote the book on music improv. But you have devoted a very large chunk of your career to educating people about improv and improv music. You and your husband Rick, from what I understand, travel around all the time and are doing classes for churches and community groups and colleges and everybody in between to teach different sort of improv stuff. And you're also creating online classes to teach music improv. Tell us a little bit about that interest in giving back and sort of supporting the next generation to become improv people.
And that, like everything else, kind of happened by accident. So the first teaching tool was I made a CD called Improv Karaoke, which was tracks for people to improvise to. And that literally came about because people would email me all the time and say, "Oh, can you send me a track of a hoedown or an Irish drinking song? Because my group wants to do it." And just so you know, legally I can't because of my contract, but you can figure those songs out. They're easy. Anyway, if someone really wanted to play it. But I could record a track similar to it, right? I could record a country track, even if it wasn't hoedown, and people could improvise to it. So then that was the idea for improv karaoke. Like, oh, I'll record tracks in different genres. And then it was like, oh, but people, if they don't know how to approach song improv, they won't know what to do with these tracks. So then I brought friends in and they improvised along with those tracks in the studio. So now there's the teaching component, me talking a little bit about it. Then you hear people improvising to it. Then there's the blank track and you do your own improv to it. So that was the first step. And then people were like, "Oh, we like that so much. Can you come teach at our improv group?" And I'm like, "Yeah, I guess I can." There's not that many people teaching musical improv, although it's growing for sure. And there are some really fantastic music improv teachers. So we would travel to different groups because a lot of groups, even if an improv group, in Kansas City, they've got a great improv team, but they don't necessarily have a musician and they don't know how to get started doing musical improv. So Rick and I developed this curriculum to teach that live. But then what was also happening is they'd be like, "This is so great, but we don't have a musician." And I'd be like, "Okay, so find a college student and teach them." But so then that was how I wrote the book. And I got really good response for the book. A lot of times an improv group would buy it for their musician that they were hoping to teach, because it's almost like you're speaking two different languages. They didn't know how to explain to the musician what it was they needed because it's so specific, like we were talking about before. And then again, during the pandemic, I was like, I'd always wanted to do an online course for musicians, right? And so I did this whole like really in-depth online course. And again, improv groups will sometimes buy it for a musician that is up and coming. So it's sort of two different things. It's teaching the singing side, and I do that with Rick because he's an improviser, actor, singer himself. So we bring sort of those two elements to teaching the singing side, but then also teaching the musician side, because there's a million improv actors and very few people who do what I do.
Yeah, it's really cool. And I so much of improv, I guess, in like a community standpoint, is focused on education. I mean, like all the improv groups that I am aware of, whether it's my friends in Pittsburgh or my friends in Syracuse or my friends in Binghamton or wherever it is, it's so focused on, hey, here's the thing that we do. Do you want to come join us for a game? Here's the thing that we do. Here's the night to come and just sort of try it out and see how it goes. And like, you don't have to worry about an audience or whatever. But for the actual technical need of musical improv, those, to your point, it's really hard to find people with those skills, who have, let's say, I don't know, 21 years experience on a TV show doing it, or 30 plus years experience doing it in total. What like how have you been responded to, having traveled around and playing for all these groups? Like, how does it feel to be kind of welcomed into all of these communities, to be the expert in the room?
Well, one thing is, it's so lovely because so many improv groups are just really appreciative and happy and wanting to learn. Like, there a lot of times there's a huge appetite for learning, right? And again, if it's in a smaller market, they may have taken every class from every improv teacher in the area. So that's kind of fun, that you're bringing something new for a lot of people that they haven't had the opportunity, and they're super excited about that. And I also, there's something I love about, like, when you go into a community, you get a sense of who they are. You get a sense of how they care for each other. And a lot of times they are really, like, so many people who are learning improv, their goal isn't that they're going to get on SNL, right? Their goal is that they're enjoying this creative thing, that this community building thing, right? Like, people, I love that people love their communities. And so it's really a joy to kind of be welcomed in like that. And then also to be able to go, okay, here we go. We've got some skills that you have not had an opportunity to explore before, and we're doing a deep dive. So, go with me because we got this. And one of my greatest joys is people who are beginners with music improv, they're terrified, right? Like, they might, like, improv is scary. Music improv is 10 times as scary for some people, for a lot of people. And so if we're doing a beginner class, we'll start and they'll be like, I'm so scared, so much language about being scared. And then in 3 hours, they'll have success. That's incredibly exciting to me, that they have, not that there's not more work for them to do, but that they can have I can do this moment. And I love, love, love bringing that to people. That really makes me happy.
Well, it's so cool, and I, just as somebody who always loves learning new things, I appreciate that you've made web versions of these things. Like, I had a chance to watch a clip of your, talking about underscoring, and like talking about, like, all right, the left hand is going to control this part of the narrative, and then the right hand is basically sound effects. And here's how I can utilize these sound effects to amplify a scene, or to add something, or to give the actor, a new direction to head in, because the story can change based on these sounds. And it's such a cool way of thinking about storytelling that, like, a lot of people don't often have a chance to explore.
Yeah. And a lot of times when a group has not had a musician, and then you sit in with them and they're like, oh my gosh, that just changed everything. It's like, yeah, it does. It does, in a really great way, that it can just really heighten everything about the show. Even when they're not singing.
Absolutely. Well, I love it, and I will just say bluntly that I think I would be terrified to, do musical improv straight up, even with you, in a 3 hour span. So kudos to all those people that you have, turned into success stories. And if we ever get you and Rick in Syracuse, we'll, I'll give it a go. We'll see what happens.
Absolutely. And I always have so much respect for people who are, like, willing to step out and try it. You know what I mean? Like, especially when they are saying, I'm really afraid of this. And it's like, yeah, but you're doing it. Like, look at you. You showed up. You're doing it. And I admire that so much. Uh, it's hard to step out of our comfort zones, especially as adults, like if you have a high school group or something, or even like little kids will do anything. Like they've got no filter yet, right? So it's super easy with little kids to get them to do stuff. But the older we get, the more we hear no and we tell ourselves no. And so to step into a situation and say, I'm going to say yes to this and I'm going to say yes to myself, that's huge.
Well, speaking of saying yes to yourself, you're somebody who I don't know if you ever say no. Like literally when I can't find an angle of your career where I'm convinced you actually sleep. Like there's always something happening. But you've got some really cool stuff coming up. You've what is it? The Phony award-winning musical is a musical that you've put together that's running in Chicago as we speak. So can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, so that was an idea from myself and my friend Lisa McQueen, who we've been pals since back when I was at Second City. And I moved away to LA. I moved back to Chicago, and her and I got together. And the leadership at IO said, "What do you two want to do?" We're like, "Oh, we get to." So this was our pet project. So it's improvising musicals in this, not only in an improvised musical, but in the style of a specific musical. Right. So the one that is happening right now is we're improvising a musical in the style of Company by Stephen Sondheim, which is this sort of 70s groovy. Yeah, and it's Sondheim, which means it's really interesting musically. Before that, we did a chorus. We did Wicked, a chorus line, um, Little Shop of Horrors, and Guys and Dolls. So this is would be our fifth one. And it's really interesting because it's what I talked about before, this deconstruction process. Like what makes this musical tick? What's interesting in it? How can we improvise within this style? But we're not just doing like a Mad Libs where we're doing the musical, but just sticking, a first responder, because that was the suggestion we got, right? Like we're really reshaping it, but in the style and genre. So it's a really interesting sort of push pull. The singers in this cast are so flipping amazing. They can do anything. And so it's like the hard part about it is sort of looking at the musical, deconstructing it, figuring out what elements we're using, what we're not. And then for me and Lisa, who share the musical direction job, to go, okay, like I could play if I was doing a regular improv show and got the suggestion of Sondheim, I could do one improvised Sondheim song, right? I've got that. But to do a whole show in the style of Sondheim that covers all the different emotional aspects of it, right? So there's got to be a ballad, there's got to be a up-tempo number, there's underscore. To do all of that in the style of Sondheim is a real challenge. And for both Lisa and I, and we've both been doing this for a really long time, that's the fun of it for me is that, and then the fact that these singers are so brilliant at it. So this show Company is runs until April 10th. And then after that, we're going to kind of do and it's every Thursday night at IO Theater in Chicago. And then after that, those Thursday night slots at 7:30 are going to be a variety of music improv nights until we figure out what our next show will be after Company, right? So it's like each musical we do about 8 weeks, and then we take a little break and we'll do some other stuff, and then we'll do another one. So who knows what's next?
Well, it sounds amazing, and I apologize if this question's a little too inside baseball, inside improv. But when you're thinking about the structure for short form improv, okay, we've got a prompt, we know who the actors are, maybe we know what the props are, go at it for 5 minutes, and then we move forward, or 30 seconds, or whatever it is. when you're creating the structure to make sure that you have a successful show that is both reminiscent of Sondheim, but also has a structural flow that can last the duration of the show, what kind of forms and structures are you putting in place to ensure not necessarily success, but to ensure that there is, I don't know, a thread to follow?
Right. And any improvised musical, there is sort of a structure that holds the whole thing together in terms of, you have an opening number, you meet your protagonist or protagonists, you meet your antagonist or antagonists, and you know what I mean? Like there's those structures where you find out who those people are and what the problem or goal is right from the beginning, right? So those are improvised, but they need to happen right at the beginning because that's what informs the whole rest of the show, right? So like in this case with Company, the central character is named Bobby. And so we have a Bobby track. It changes every week. It's a different actor every week. And they are the central character that we know is going to be our protagonist, right? But what we don't know is, all the other stuff that we're getting from suggestions. And then we have a second track. There's a character in there. I've forgotten her real name, but she sings The Ladies Who Lunch, and she's the sort of cynical, jaded, she's been around forever. She's that one, and she gets to sing those big belty songs. So we have her track also, right? So, but that's kind of all we know in terms of that. The other actors all get to choose whoever they want to be. But we know we have Bobby, and he's our protagonist right from the top. So that helps us get started. And we have an opening number that is very, very much like the opening number of the show, like a sort of condensed, very much like it. And that one's preset. And then we have a closing number that's very like the closing number of the show, and that one's preset. Besides that, all that stuff in the middle is improvised. But part of it is because these actors have improvised a lot of musicals, they know how to create that arc. And there's always got to be that 11th hour number that, oh, we've learned something important and now we're headed towards the end. Like, and that's true in any musical, you know what I mean? Like, regardless. So they have that big sense of structure of that arc. And so we can leave so much open-ended. And I don't know if you're familiar with Company, but it's a musical that has very little plot, which actually kind of makes it even easier because we're not having to work around the original plot in any way. So we really can create, it's super open-ended. Before this one, a chorus line, I think, was our most successful one. And it doesn't have much plot either. So we've been kind of learning which musicals work best for this deconstruction process because everyone wants it to be open-ended. We don't want it to be like, oh, we're doing Little Shop of Horrors, but we're just, instead of a plant, it's a bicycle. You know what I mean? Like, that's not interesting to any of us, right? So we want to figure out how much we can deconstruct it. But it really is because these singers have such a good sense of that arc of the protagonist, the antagonist. They're having to be the conflict. The conflict has to build. And then there has to be some sort of resolution, whether it's positive or negative, doesn't matter, some sort of resolution. And then we have the big closing number where we're like, this is what just happened. Yay, we're done.
That sounds like so much fun, and I really appreciate your comment about thinking about those sort of base structures of like a chorus line, for example, is like a 100% character driven narrative. Like we know that as that show progresses, like people are going to disappear off stage, and maybe we care, maybe we don't. And like when you use that as like an improv structure, you're like, all right, cool, like we can play around with this, we can figure out what gets an emotional hook or what gets a laugh, and then at the end of the day, some people get accepted for the chorus line and some people don't.
Right,
Like
right. And we use so we had it be the suggestion that we would get would be an occupation, and they were all interviewing for a job. right? So, which was kind of interesting, right? So all of their backstory, all of their character work was around that job, whether it was a scientist or a school teacher or, whatever it was. And then we would use the conceit that the audience was interviewing for the job as well, but they all got cut right away.
Well, that sounds like an absolute blast, Laura. Well, I wanna thank you for making time and space. This has been an absolute joy. I always like to leave room at the end of the show just to see if there's anything that we haven't covered or anything that's kind of on your mind that you want to share. So, is there anything that we haven't tackled that you want to throw out there?
I can't really think of anything. We did a good job. I mean, we do have some when I'm touring with Who's Live, that's sort of kind of full time for me. But we have the summer off. And then Rick and I will be doing some teaching music improv. And if it's something that someone's interested in learning, if they go to my website, that's the easy way to find out what's on my calendar and when and where I'm teaching. Rick and I are teaching or doing different events. And so my website is laurahall.com. But if anyone wanted to email me, if you had questions about the workshops or anything like that, it's laura@laurahall.com.
And I'll also put in just a little point that like following you on Instagram and Facebook is a just really nice behind the scenes of all the cool stuff you're doing. And it's always fun just to see like, here's a quick shot of the audience at, our most recent tour in, Missoula or wherever you are.
Yeah.
Like, it's pretty awesome.
Doing with the touring, it's nice to post stuff. We get to play at these gorgeous theaters and we'll have different people show up. Like Drew Carey sat in on a show recently, was sort of a surprise guest, and Phil Lamar showed up as in the audience at a show. So it's like it's fun to post that. I don't post nearly as much. Jeff Davis and Greg Proops post way more than me, but yeah. But it's fun to, especially when we're touring, because we're everywhere. We're just all over the country.
Well, Laura, thanks so much for all you do. This was a delightful chat.
Thank you, Ryan. Great talking with you.
I have had the privilege of interviewing tons of people, over 40 people for this show and, previous films and projects. And I don't know if I've ever interviewed somebody who was just so peppy and just comical and fun as this Laura Hall character. Maybe she was giving me a bit the whole time, but she seemed absolutely sweet. I hope you enjoyed this conversation. Laura is an inspiration. And, I'm still stuck on this whole idea that she just figured out how to play over 100 different genres of music over a very short period of time. So if you're interested in checking out Laura's work, go to laurahall.com, follow her on social media, and see where the Who's Live Anyway tour is going. It could be coming your way, and you could see her amazing musical prowess in person. If you need more interviews in your life, I suggest taking a look at the back catalog. In the realm of media development and audio, I've got some pretty cool interviews with people that I am excited to highlight. On episode 41, I talk with audiobook narrator Stefan Rudnicki. Episode 31, I talk with Henri Houston, who is a Netflix executive and a former executive at HBO. If you're interested in alternative music, in episode 18, I interview Muddy Muddy Boss Tones guitarist Lawrence Katz. And then if you need more film and video in your life, Phil Vigent, the creator of Pro 8mm, who makes 8mm film, is on episode 13. Equally, if you need more Ryan Zlomek in your life, you can find me online on Facebook. Search for The World of Ryan Zlomek. You can also find @Ryan Zlomek on Instagram, TikTok, and Blue Sky. Or you can email me meditations@ryanzlomek.com if you have thoughts you want to share or you have any feedback on the show. As always, I want to thank you so much for listening. If you like what you heard, please go give a review. Tell somebody you know about the show. Just spread the word, because these conversations mean a lot to me, and I hope they mean a lot to you. Thanks so much for all your support, and as always, don't forget to make space for conversation, because you just might learn something. Have an awesome, improv-tastic day.